So, like you mentioned, I'll be sharing our data on African views on economic powers, and this is actually from our 10th round of survey. So we could go into the first slide. Yes. So we're looking at the perceived influence of countries and institutions among 29 African countries. And our data shows that on average, across 29 countries, more than half of citizens say that China, regional organizations, the African Union, and the United States have a positive political and economic influence on African countries. Now, from the same slide, we see that about half, which is 49%, say the same for the EU. And somewhat fewer, which is roughly 4 in 10, welcome the influence of their former colonial powers. That's at 41%, India and Russia. But still saying on this slide, I think what is important to note is that the negative perceptions are far less common, as you can see. So when you take the EU, for example, you see that fewer than 1 in 5 respondents, which is 18%, see its influence as negative, right? But again, what is interesting here, again, with the EU, is that substantial proportions, which is 1/3 of the respondents, they actually say that they don't know enough the influence of the EU to be able to assess its quality. And I think that's like an interesting data point to note for the EU. So we'll move on to the next slide, where we want to look at the country breakdown of those who say the influence of the EU is positive. Again, about half of Africans, that's 49%, say that the EU has a positive political and economic influence on their countries. But you can see that these perceptions vary widely by country. For instance, positive views are highest in countries like Liberia at 78%, Cabo Verde at 74%, Sao Tome at 69%, Morocco, Cote d'Ivoire, and Gambia at 62%. But fewer than 1 in 3 citizens welcome the influence of the EU in Botswana at 31%, Mali at 30%, and Tunisia at 23%. Okay, so on the next slide, what we're trying to look at is the perceptions of influence when we group our countries by their regional organizations. So for instance, the ECOWAS here then stands for member countries in West Africa. We have the East Africa Community, we have the SADC, the Southern Africa Development Committee, and the rest. And I think for me, the main story here is that we see that ECOWAS and the East Africa countries, East Africa Community countries, that is the West and East African countries, they tend to hold more favorable views of their former colonial power, of the AU, of the EU, and then of their regional organization than the other regional blocs. And another key interesting data point here is that the SADC countries actually trail by 10 or more percentage points in their positive assessments of all the 4 entities grouped over there. But the exception is the ECCAs that view the original organization. They have more favorable perception as compared to the ECOWAS and the EAC members. And I think this is one slide that Bonnie is really, really interested in. So maybe when we get to the interaction part, he can explain it further. Yeah. So that brings us to the end of our data with regards to how Africans see these economic powers. But I'll quickly move on to share the data on migration because we have some interesting data points over there as well. Yes, so we asked our respondents in 28 African countries to tell us how much, if at all, have you considered moving to another country to live. And our data shows that on average across 28 African countries, almost half, which is 46% of African citizens, say they have considered leaving their countries to live in another country. And this actually includes 26% who say they've given emigration a lot of thoughts. So we just wanted to emphasize on those who say a lot, and that's almost a quarter, that's 26%. Now, thoughts of immigrating are most common in countries like Liberia at 78%, in Gambia at 68%, Sao Tome and Principe at 68%, Cabo Verde at 64%, and in my country, Ghana, at 61%. It's only in 2 countries do we see fewer than 2 in 10 respondents saying that they've considered migrating. And so that's Madagascar, where it's only 14% who say they've considered immigrating, and Tanzania, the lowest, with only 9% who say they've considered emigrating. So on the next slide, we're still staying on immigrating. We wanted to look at it in demographics, so by gender and by age. And you see that more men than women say that they have thought about leaving the country. So that's 50% of men versus 43% of women. When we look at age, the young adults are also more likely to consider emigrating than their elders. And this reaches as high as 55% amongst those aged 18 to 35 years. They've considered emigrating. So we asked our respondents to tell us the reason for which they want to emigrate. And the most popular, well, the highest reason was that they cite a desire to search for work opportunities, better jobs, better work opportunities. And that's almost half of it, or maybe half of it, because that's 49% of the citizens saying so. But we'll have 20% saying that they want to escape economic hardship, and 9% saying they want to escape poverty. So you see that all these 3 reasons are linked in some way. They all scream for me economic indicators. They're looking for jobs, they want to escape economic hardships, they want to escape poverty, you know. And we also asked, which country would you want to go to? And the most popular destinations for potential Africa and immigrants are Europe at 32% and North America. Not much difference. We're looking at 32% versus 30%. But what is interesting for us here is the fact that quite a sizable number would also actually prefer to emigrate to another country on the African continent. And that's a revealing point for us as well, that it's not everybody who's seeking to emigrate that wants to go to Europe or China or, you know, North America, but we're actually looking to go within our own countries as well. Yeah. And on my last slide, we're looking at the economic impacts of immigration. And so if you reverse the lens to look at attitudes towards immigration, we find that on average across 28 countries, fewer than half, that's 47% of citizens actually believe that immigrant workers are good for their nation's economy. 47% believe so. But again, we see that more than 4 in 10, which is 42%, say it's fairly bad or very bad for the economy if people from other countries come here to live and work for several years. Right. Now, if you look at the country level, you see that positive assessments of immigrants' economic contributions are actually widespread in countries like Cote d'Ivoire, Sao Tome and Principe, Cabo Verde, Benin, and Tanzania at 60%. But fewer than 1 in 4 citizens agree in countries like Gabon at 23% and Morocco at 21%. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
No, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maame. It's very interesting, this last slide in particular. I think it's really interesting. So I'm Aline Sabourin, and I work with the ECDPM in the European Foreign and Development Policy team, and we looked at the EU's in its international partnerships, and we try to question the implications of those changes in the partner countries, so at partner country level. And we really welcome the results of the 28 countries surveys for this 10th round, because there is a huge part on the consequence part on the international relations that you presented. And we see some trends as you presented, but there are also a lot of variations according to countries. And also one result really struck me is the way the EU and China were perceived comparatively for the way they manage or they positively or negatively manage the COVID-19 crisis towards African countries. And there is a huge difference. I mean, I didn't do the average, but it's the proportions are something like 40% China influenced by 40% positively the management of the crisis, whereas for Europe and the EU, so Europe including the colonial powers and the EU, we are more around 6 to 10%, which is a huge gap. So that was for the management of the COVID-19 crisis. Now, as I said, that the numbers, the figures that you provide are really interesting for us, because we provided some research on how those changes at the EU level, so which is basically encompassing there is a new strategy, the Global Gateway Strategy, since 2021, that is more interest driven, that is provides a different approach. There is also a new way of working together as a Team Europe, as the EU. So with the EU and its member states, it's called the Team Europe approach. And there is also a new instrument, the new financial instrument, which actually makes a lot of has a lot of practical implications on the way the partnership is managed. I will not get into details of all these changes for the EU and for the, but what was interesting to present today is actually how these implications were felt by partner countries in the research we initiated in some countries in since 2023. Sorry. And I just wanted to mention 4 of the findings. So first, the question of the timing was key. How do you manage the changes, the shifts? The question of the timing was at stake, because the new approach raised a lot of expectations in the African countries, with the African partners. There were a lot of early announcements of huge numbers of support, but there was a lack of political, administrative, and organizational backing actually to implement those shifts rapidly, because we know that all the changes, especially in that scale, take time to land in reality and to have a proper effect in reality. And this question of the timing and time lapse was really mentioned as one of the first big challenge. And now the question is, now that the EU is working towards a new long-term budget for after 2027, the question will be to actually how to make the instrument, the tools to finance its international cooperation partnerships match the strategy and the objectives of the strategy. And that's one of the key question now. The second point I wanted to mention is the communication. The communication was raised in our discussions with the interviewees as really having been a huge challenge, because the changes had not felt as if they were well enough communicated to the partners, because of the lack of information from the EU itself. Like sometimes even the EU officials and administrative staff didn't know how these changes would affect the relationship and the work with the partners. Some interviewees also mentioned that this would have been also better received probably if some high-level representatives would have come in person to explain the changes and take the time for the discussion. And that was and that created some issues like in terms of trust and stuff like that. The third point that we highlighted in the research was the question of the competition. Competition, because the EU presented at the beginning the Global Gateway and some of the tools within as being managed with the rule of the first come, first serve, like all the bankable projects would be financed first, etc. And that was felt as like putting the competition high among the African partners. But what the EU had not in mind, and that was raised at the moment, is also that this competition is a two-way street, in that sense that the EU is also not the only partner in Africa. And there are a lot of other partners who propose other tools or other means of partnerships and support that leverage this competition. And the fourth and final point that I wanted to raise, and that also is one key last but not least, the question of the definition of the mutually beneficial interests, because the EU's approach is more interest driven, and the idea was to the challenge right now is kind of to reconcile the trilemma, not a dilemma, but a trilemma of trying to find a way to promote the EU's interests, promote the values, and also take care of the ownership and the ownership of the partners and the partners' interests themselves. And for that, to define those mutually beneficial interests, aiming at some more equal partnerships, appears to be one of the key challenges. And that would be the final point, knowing that last week a colleague of mine, Pauline Véron, released a paper on the topic, on the perceptions, updating a little bit the research we had done, and also extending it to Latin America and Asia. Voilà.
Thank you, Amandine. Thank you, Amandine. But so indeed, this is complementary. This is research with experts. I mean, going to check how European instruments and strategies land in Africa, but talking to African experts.
Yeah.
So it is indeed complementary. Yeah. When you said competition, for me, I also see it as, or I often hear also from African ambassadors in Brussels to say, stop focusing on this competition with China. We're happy with your global gateway and we need investment. We need our youth to get jobs and so on. So please, yes, investment. And it's okay to be focusing on your own interest, but try to align and don't just see it as we only have to work with you. And I'm looking at your list because I see Namibia, more than half sees EU's influence as positive. And it was actually the Namibian ambassador who was saying one of their global gateway flagships. I mean, they're always presented as one of the examples as a country, but where indeed an investment in green hydrogen was with investment from the global gateway. But part of that project was actually also financed by China. To me, that's the kind of investment that African countries, I mean, it's aligning with the strategy of Namibia. It wasn't just one government, but it was across different governments. And the Namibians had said, we have conditions to interact with you. We need to consult with our elders and our local governments. And so it was actually owned, but it was also not just we can only work with Global Gateway or Team Europe, but we will see with the different partners that Africa has. And I mean, I'm not sure many, now I'm probably not being politically correct, but not many Europeans would say, let's have joint investment with Russia. Yeah. But with China as the best of, I mean, the products that they were offering or the technology that they were offering were the best and the most adapted to the country. So for me, when you say competition, I think it's often seen as if the Global Gateway was the competition to the Belt and Road Initiative of China.
Yeah.
And from an African perspective, it doesn't really matter who finances, but it's the investment that needs to come in. But so I don't know how that influences perspectives from citizens also. But so when I hear competition, I always think of that. And I think there's so much that needs to be done. We should see it as complementary, but of course that's easy said from a chair of a think tank and not the one who's managing or having to put the flag or these elements. But so thank you very much. I think your information indeed on migration was also very interesting. And indeed when we think of migration, I mean, we know between Europe and Africa, that's quite a contentious issue. But there is actually a lot of migration within Africa, but our migration expert unfortunately is not here, and I will definitely not venture into those issues. But based on the presentation of both Amandine and Maame, any specific questions? Let me see if there's somebody else. Then Philippe? No? Philippe, go ahead.
No,
Yeah, pardon. So. I'm going to.
If I would like to ask some question on the African results, and notably on the positive influence of the EU. Have you checked to what extent there is a kind of correlation between the influence of the former colonial power and the influence of the EU? To what extent the sometimes negative perceived influence of the former colonial power has a negative impact on the reputation of the EU? And maybe further to what Kathleen was saying, is a kind of negative correlation between China's influence and the EU's influence. And since that, then I see in Zambia, where there is a huge Chinese presence, the influence of the EU is considered as rather low. So do you see types of correlations between these different competing influences? And then on the migration side, I was a bit surprised by the lack of attractiveness of the Middle East. Why we know that, notably in the Horn of Africa, a lot of Africans are migrating to the Gulf states. So that's not reflected in the perceptions. So are there regional trends in the migration ambitions? I mean, between the different tracks, or the West African tracks more sensitive to migration issues than the others? Is there a developmental aspect to it, or have the low income countries or middle income countries a higher share of young wishing to migrate, or we have seen some causal relations there? Sorry.
Difficult question.
Yes, I think we haven't done a direct cross relation looking at the negative impacts of maybe the former colonial powers versus that compared to China or to the EU. I think what we did was just a direct what the data says in how the citizens perceive these influences, whether they're positive or negative. Yeah, but I think there are different data analysis that we can do to look at that direct correlation we're looking at. You ask, yes, and we'll do that. Usually we do that in our Pan-African publications and our working papers. Yes, where we do more data analysis on it. But it's also interesting to look at this data to see that in the view of citizens, the influence of the former colonial powers is quite high. That's like 1/3 of it, saying that they think it's negative, as compared to the EU, where it's only 18%.
It depends on what type of form colonial power.
Yeah.
Yes.
French-speaking Africa may be different.
Yes. So we can actually do that breakdown in terms of the kind of former colonial powers, like you're saying, whether it's Francophone or Lusophone. And even looking at China, I think with the same correlation between the EU and the Chinese, just 18 and 19%, which is the same. African citizens are saying they have negative influence on their economic and political. So there's no competition there, as he was saying. Yeah, but yeah, it'll be interesting to have a breakdown of the former colonial powers, whether it's like a French colonial power or an English one or also former one.
What in the countries I looked at for for today, I just very quickly, and including Cameroon, of course, that there was no real correlation because I was expecting the same. I looked at 12 out of the 28 countries, and I didn't find a correlation really between the negative perceptions of the former colonial powers and the negative perception of the EU. But I found an interesting and weird correlation between negative perception of the former colonial powers and Russia, and the positive perception on Russia. I mean, it's quite obvious actually. Yeah, but it's really not scientific. The way I picked the countries is really not representing it. It's just
Was a random.
It was Congo, Brazzaville, Cameroon, Botswana, Uganda, Namibia, Mali. Mali is a bit of a specific case. Morocco, and Tunisia, and apart from Mali and Morocco, I would say like this. This applies. And yeah.
Jean-Claude?
Thank you. I'm Jean-Claude.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the explanations and the presentations. I'm Jean-Claude Guadin, a former EU official and also formerly an EU ambassador to Madagascar. Two small questions on this. Have you or will you be looking at other emerging powers who also are running for influence in Africa? I'm thinking of Turkey, for example, or the Emirates, who are more and more influential, at least in parts of Africa. And why not Brazil? And the second question is more about the nature or the substance of the influence. In fact, we're ranking here different partners and countries as to their level or the strength or the intensity of their global political and economic influence on the country where you express themselves. But in fact, the nature of the influence can be very different from one partner to the other. For example, Russia may be very influential in the area of security, whereas European Union may be bringing more of an influence on the economic side. Others may be less on the political side, for example, the African Union. So is it not a little bit complex or artificial to compare level of influence when the field of influence can be very different from one partner to the other? My third question is about the US. It looks like you've been running the study in 2024 and 2025. Obviously, that does not take into account the recent changes of the American attitude vis-à-vis Africa, which could then impact future surveys. Is it? Thank you.
That's true. And I think in terms, just on that last point, we still have some countries that we're yet to conduct survey in. Bonnie, is that right? Like Sierra Leone, for instance. So that may influence the citizens' responses when it gets to that question. But we've done about 32 countries already, before the changes in the US, like you mentioned. So it'll be interesting in the next rounds how that will play out. Because then when citizens are answering that question, I'm pretty sure they take into account the new changes that's happened in the US global parties. Yes, and in terms of the other emerging powers, I think that's a very important point that you raised, and we always like these opportunities to get some of these ideas. We pass it on to the questionnaire committee, who meets every time to look at our questions for the next survey. So definitely we'll pass it on to find out, look, is there a way we can look into other emerging powers, global powers like Turkey and the Brazil that you mentioned. But for this round, we decided to focus on these political parties. And also the nuances of it, like you're saying, maybe Russia will be perceived well in terms of security and not necessarily economic influence or political influence, but then maybe the US will be perceived highly in economic versus security and all that. And I think that's really interesting and that you point out. But you know, our questionnaire goes for the very hard. What do you think? What do you think? We leave it to the doctors, Aberdeen, to look at the nuances and look at the qualitative side of the survey and ask the whys and yeah, just to complement that data. But that's a point we'll definitely take.
Thank you. Carol?
I've been working for 5 different private companies here in Belgium.
Yeah, so that the people online here.
I've been working for 5 different companies here in Belgium, in Africa. On migration, what is your opinion on circular migration for highly educated young African professionals who have studied in Africa, come and work here for 1 year, then go back over there?
It's a very interesting question you asked, because in our survey on the migration, we actually noticed that citizens who have post-secondary education were part of the people who were willing to emigrate. And they were wondering why. You are really educated. Why won't you stay in your country to work? But the issue, it goes back to the reasons they cite, that they want better work opportunities. So then it means that perhaps to them, they're not finding that in their respective countries, which is, I've come out of university, but I don't have a job. So then why don't then I go out there despite my degree and go and look for a job so I can take care of myself and my families? And we actually also found that people who are both part-time and full-time employed were also part of those who said they want to emigrate. So then even those who have jobs still think it's better out there, maybe because the pay will be better as compared to their countries, or maybe because the living conditions in their countries are high. You may be earning money in your country, but you still can't afford your rent or pay for utilities. So you think that maybe if you earn better elsewhere, then you'll be able to afford and take care of your family. So it's really interesting that you point it out there, but it all boils down again to the economic indicators that the data showed, either to escape economic hardship or poverty, or to actually look for a better paying job. And that was very interesting finding even for us. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. My name is Doreen, and I work for the Organization of the African, Caribbean, and Pacific States. I found that presentation very interesting, particularly on the migration. And I'm not sure if you have already developed that policy document. I would be interested in the intra-Africa migration to understand the rulings and where there is interest in that intra-Africa migration. And just last week, we also heard of a sudden migration trend that is also taking place from Africa to the Caribbean, where there was about 11 who died, 11 Malian nationals died just trying to get into the islands of the Caribbean. So perhaps there could be a research that is done on that, or maybe you already have statistics on that, if migration is now moving to the Caribbean states or not. I don't see them there, but I see them in other places. So that would be something I would be very interested in. And on the influences, I did not notice on one of your slides the Sahel states. I would have loved to see the view of the Sahel states, particularly in post-colonial relations there. So maybe those, maybe you have it somewhere. I would just like to hear your views. Thank you.
Yeah. On the Sahel states, so we are able to just pick those countries that form the Sahel states and then run the analysis so that we're able to tell the picture clearly. So it will be something we'll have to do for you later. We've not done that analysis. Yeah, so we can do that for you beyond this meeting. Yeah. But also in terms of the countries you were mentioning, we said 22% said they would look within Africa. What we have here yesterday, we're looking at it. We are able to tell which prominent country in the region, but yeah, within Africa that they prefer to go, because 12% of the respondents said they will go to the most prominent country in the region, but we'll have to run the data to know which prominent country it is. And 5% said just another country in the region they don't want to go. Another 5% said elsewhere in Africa. Right? So those two, just another country and elsewhere, are more random. But for the 12% that said the most prominent country in the region, we'll be able to get the list of that most prominent and then also share with you. We don't have it here, but it's something we can run the analysis on and share with. Yeah, but we do have options for the Caribbeans in the survey. It's another thing we'll take away. So we had the Europe and then North Africa, Central or South America, but that was only 3% that said they would want to go there. And even Australia is here, but also just 4% said they would want to immigrate. And then, of course, we have the Asia, China, Russia, but only at 2% as well. So yeah, we didn't have but we did have 4% saying outside of Africa, but they won't specify where. So that could include the Caribbean, but we'll never know because it wasn't specifically stated in our response category.
Any other questions? If not, I have, but I'm probably linking the two different presentations on democracy and your trilemma. I mean, the dialogue or the triangle from the perspective of Europe is indeed our own interest, aligning with African interest and our shared values. And it's a challenge to bring these three together. From, again, and this is not based on thorough analysis, so maybe you have some of that, but from the perceptions I have from some of the African colleagues would be, okay, shared values, all very nice and well, but quite, I mean, we often hear double standards, and so we prefer to be more transactional, like the way China interacts. Tell me what your interest is, we will tell you our interest, and we interact. I must say, quite a few civil society actors, trade unionists, she was from South Africa, was saying, please don't stop with this, with the values. We need European, not European values, but Europe to insist on some of these values to help us strengthen the rights of workers, which other international parties of Africa, without mentioning the first on the list, have very different perspectives on rights of workers and so on. So actually, we really like the insistence in our relationship with Europe to also focus on values. I'm just wondering whether in your surveys, the distinction between the more transactional economic cooperation and the value agenda, I'm not saying conditionalities, but some of these values that are being put, whether there is a way maybe in the next, if it's not in this one, in the next one, to get a sense there of, because for Europe, it remains difficult to combine, but it's interesting to see how indeed African citizens perceive this value agenda, or whether they say it's too many words, not enough. I mean, let's just deal with what is really needed and the more transactional relationship. But I don't know whether that's already included or whether
It's not.
not. Okay, sorry. But I was linking it maybe to democracy indeed as being one of the values. But also there, yeah. What is democracy? Is it fair elections? Is it, how do you then put it as a conditionality or an added element to the relationship? It's not so straightforward. But I see Emily.
But whilst
Yeah, go ahead.
you try to read online, I was having a chat with Emily and we're just discussing the data where we saw that in Africa, 60% gave China a positive assessment in terms of political and economic influence. But then the other countries is less than 60. And we're asking why. What is it that the Chinese are doing that makes African citizens perceive them to know, yeah, versus what the EU is doing or not doing, or what the US is doing. And Amadi, you were giving some interesting perspective on that. I think we should, we should share why African citizens think the Chinese is doing so well?
I'm not the expert on China, but I have two colleagues who work on that specifically, Mariela and Pauline. No, I was talking mostly about the conditionality aspect. Like what we heard again in this research about China is that China was an easier partner to deal with than the EU, because it was the contracts were more transparent, more quicker to sign, with less pages, more accessible in a way, and the partnership was seen as more accessible, and also the results were the Chinese were delivering more quickly on the infrastructure especially. So it was more visible for the people. So that's one thing. But behind that, one thing that again, not the people, but indeed the government part and the representative of civil society told us is that what they see in China is also some partnership that is made without conditionalities, without the conditionality on human rights. So linking and democracy and rule of law, etc. Linking to what you mentioned, I would think, and also maybe as a researcher, that it's a bit more complicated than that, because it's this conditionality on human rights, democracy raises a few questions. So first, how can the EU now and the member states work on that, because the conditionalities don't work in any case, and it's less and less of a main interest. But then the second question is, as part of the deal, China probably doesn't put any conditionalities on human rights, democracy, but has an economic conditionality, because the contracts are linked to bringing in companies from China, and that is something that is maybe less seen by the people. So that was just my 2 cents on it. But again, I'm not the expert, and you have worked way more consistently on this, yeah. Thank you.
Maybe a follow-up from Emma, from the let's see, she was from the European Partnership for Democracy, and she's asking, is there a disconnect between people perceiving China positively but not wanting to immigrate there?
Very interesting. Yeah, because when you look at the data, it was only 2% who said they actually wanted to move to either China or Russia, but at the same time, they gave them a high assessments. I don't know. I don't know. Yes.
Future project.
It's a disconnect. Versus I don't want to go there to work and live, but at the same time, I think that they have a positive economic and political influence in my country.
But I think it's because China's investments tend to be very large, infrastructure projects that are much more visible. So people are reacting into that. That they can see,
the road,
National Assembly. So it's I think the visualization of the projects that are supported by China, and maybe to some extent, I think the EU might be unfairly judged in this regard, because the projects that the EU will support will be education, maybe health, and people will not actually know that it is the EU that is supporting those projects. And that's why here we do have quite a substantial proportion of the population that say they don't know. They haven't really had enough to make a judgment on the influence of the EU. Whereas I think in the Chinese case, I think it's these huge projects that people can just visualize. But of course, the ease of, if you were to migrate to Europe, at least the language you will be able to fit in. China makes it extremely difficult for people to go and migrate and live in China because of the language.
I think
Just to jump in on that,
Yeah.
when the questions are asked about the EU, are you asking questions that the EU, or are you asking questions about Europe? Because the my experience I know that the EU was much less known in the past than, for example, the EDF, because people associated the European action in the countries with the European Development Fund. And I have anecdotes on that to tell, and I don't want to share to waste your time. I think the issue of visibility is a very valid point. We made a survey in Cameroon a couple of years ago, and the region where we had invested in infrastructure 30 years ago people remembered us much more than in other regions where we hadn't physical infrastructure investments to testify of our presence in the country. It's budget support or institutional capacity building is not something which is very visible and tangible to promote. While physical infrastructure, you see it immediately, and so there's that aspect of it. But I would be interested to see to what extent the influence of China indeed has evolved over time. And coming back to the Zambia case, and of course, Zambia was on one of the first places where China was actively investing.
Yeah.
But the perception of China among the population is evolving as well. Because a lot of people realize that the Chinese may not necessarily be that much closer to the people, and they not necessarily have that in the long term, that much quality investments. Paying attention to the concerns of the people than what was imagined. So the visibility and the long-term impact may be two different issues. So maybe I don't know if the popularity of China in Zambia, for example, has decreased over recent years because of these disappointments.
This is our first question in our survey on this, right? We don't have.
Yes, we don't have a comparative.
Comparative, yes, that's the first round.
Yeah.
But I wanted to just add that in a number of the instances, you would need to add the African Union and the European Union together. Because some of the projects are implemented through continental bodies. So the African CDC and the African Union under the COVID arrangements actually was seen as a front for all the funding towards COVID. So you'd see that in recent times, the African Union is featuring quite much prominently in the minds of the population. So in some ways, some of the analysis have to take into account that collaboration between the African Union or some of the African continental bodies and the European Union. Obviously, China also puts on a show in a lot of the support they give. Also, even the COVID, the whatever they did was all over, right? And it was China splashed all over it. So that's also part of the way to improve, the general perceptions.
I think just one interesting anecdote from in 2017, we did ask question on Chinese influence, not necessarily in the same format, but we asked what do you like the most about China, and the most common popular response was the cost of the goods from China is affordable.
Exactly.
What do you like the least about China? Is the goods that they sell are not durable. So we love the cost, but we don't like the fact that it's not durable.
Yeah, I think actually we've come to the end of this, but so already plenty of ideas. Andrew's gone, but for students to also get involved and do PhDs and so on, using your data and studying some of the trends. But yeah, it just shows again the wealth of information and the opportunities for more analysis. And I think indeed in part to support also, because you say African citizen voices to help African decision makers and policymakers, but I think we also can learn from this for your partners to find and design support, which is what we still aim to do in part of our partnership, to make sure that is aligned with what is needed. And I think indeed, when we talk about democracy and supporting democracy, there's no big flags or no big signaling to say this is the European flag. And I think if you talk to quite a few of the EU officials, there is certainly a sense of frustration that it is, we've been there for so long, we've been supporting for so long, very valuable support, and it's not being seen or we're being constantly criticized. And so that doesn't make necessarily the dialogue very easy, and sometimes pushes them in a defensive position, which doesn't help necessarily the conversation. But we just had an Africa-Europe ministerial meeting last week or the week before. And I must say, we had presentations, a public presentation also, and it sounded like we were all big hunky-dory, and the minister said it was as if we were reading from the same script, and it sounded a little bit too good to be true. We tried to say, come on, there are some issues, which is okay. And I think that's what is important in dialogue, to also, I'm not saying agree to disagree, but to point out where interests are different or visions are different. Sugarcoating it with we're all big friends and one big family, I don't think is necessarily going to help the mood forward. But the positive thing is the mood was very different. And I don't know whether that's in part thanks to DT in the US, or that showed, a very different approach, and where Europe wants to show we're dependable, we've been there for a long time and we want to stay here, but we are partners anyway, and I hope ECDPM and Afrobarometer continues to partner and do interesting events. But so, thank you very much for sharing it.